We are very privileged today to have another opportunity to work together, to raise ideas, to raise suggestions. I want to remind everyone in your comments and ideas to try to be as specific as possible. The more specific we can be in reference to the NSABB draft, the more useful it is likely to be to the policymakers ultimately. During the course of this day, our aim is to dig deeper into the key issues that were developed in a preliminary way yesterday, and we're very privileged to begin with a group who will reveal some of the insights that they have gleaned from the science of safety and the science of public communication, two areas that abut directly on the consideration of gain-of-function research of concern. Without any further ado, let me turn the program over to our moderator, Dr. Baruch Fischhoff.
Thank you, Harvey. Well, thank you all for being here. One of the things that was clear as we organized these workshops was that the human element is central to this process. So there's individuals who maintain or violate safety. There are organizations that reward or discourage safety. There are institutions that are needed to take full advantage of the technology. There are industries that do or do not learn from their experience in an organized way. There are government and there are regulatory and other mechanisms that encourage people to work on the technology or create burdens that make it difficult to pursue careers and research in this area, and perhaps drive the research to places that are less safe. And there are adversaries who may want to take advantage of the inventions here, the information risk as described. So at our first workshop, we had two of the present speakers, Monica Schoch-Spana, to talk about the communications, the two-way communications that are needed with the public in order to inform the industry about the constraints under which it has a license to operate and to keep the public appraised of what the industry is doing. And Gavin Huntley-Fenner, who spoke about the human factor science that underlies engineering for safety. In following the deliberations since then, and particularly the NSABB meetings, where there was a great deal of attention to the issue of safety culture, we realized that there was another element of science which we needed, which is the science of organizational behavior that determines whether or not organizations function in a safe way. So a challenge for those of us in the social behavioral and decision sciences is that each of us is a social behavior and decision scientist. So we all, in order to get through life, we all have intuitions about how to get along with other people and how to make decisions. And as a result, it's often tempting to let our intuitions guide us when the time comes to decide how to instruct people or how to learn from experience. And as a result, we thought it was important to have to provide access to this community in which the social behavioral decision sciences have typically not played a central role, to provide access to that science so that the work can be done in a way that minimizes the risks and realizes the potential of the technology. So each of our speakers will speak for about 15 minutes, and then we'll have open discussion. So Monica, Ruthanne is first. And you have the biographies in the material.
Thank you. So today I'm going to summarize a few of the ways in which organizational and cultural factors influence how researchers interpret and respond to issues of safety and security in their laboratories. I'm a sociologist and I study regulation in scientific laboratories. I was part of a research team led by Susan Silby at MIT, in which we spent over 10 years studying the implementation of an environment, health, and safety management system at a major research university in the northeastern United United States. So we have detailed longitudinal observations of laboratory practices in chemistry, biology, and engineering labs, and thinking about how researchers understand and interpret and interact with the law and with requirements related to safety. Since 2002, I've been observing Canadian regulators as they design, through extensive public consultations with the public, but with scientists and also with the organizations in which they work, new biosafety and security regulations that have just gone into force. I'm going to take you to the heart of the matter. The laboratories in which researchers are handling materials and making decisions that have implications for their health, for public health, and also for national and international security. Sociologists and anthropologists have long observed that such decision-making is mediated by social organization. That is, human action and decisions are mediated, they're influenced, they're shaped, they are constrained by the ways in which we organize ourselves, be it families, be it communities, professions, and in this case, laboratories and organizations. Our decision-making is also mediated or influenced by the culture in those social environments. So the values or principles that emerge in those realms, the underlying assumptions about what it means to be a member of those realms. So in what we believe and what we observe in organizations, in scientific laboratories, is that people act in part based on the meaning or the significance of the act in the given context. So I'm going to start with the issue of culture. I'm going to go back to the summer of 2014. The Committee on Energy and Commerce held a hearing to understand the well-known anthrax and smallpox incidents. And over the course of 2 hours and 40 minutes, the term culture was used 33 times. So every 5 minutes, someone, be it an executive, a politician, a scientist, a consultant, raised the issue of culture. Later that month, the National Research Council released an excellent report entitled Safe Science, Promoting a Culture of Safety in Academic Chemical Research. It's a 100-page report, well worth the read, that made recommendations about how safety cultures have operated successfully in organizations and how they might be graphed onto academic laboratories. In the NSABB meetings in September of 2015, Professor Drew Endy described the need for a culture of citizenship in science. And as you see in recommendation 4 from the board, the need to foster a culture of responsibility. So safety culture, which was pioneered in the aviation and energy industries, and then later moved into chemical industries, has been credited with improving safety in these organizations. There's now a concerted effort to think about how we might bring these into scientific laboratories. The idea of bringing in a culture of safety, a culture of responsibility, is that culture can self-consciously be engineered, and it can be a means of going beyond compliance. So integrating concerns for health, safety, and security into everyday practices, work, and interactions, so that those concerns influence how we make decisions in relation to how we use materials, which materials we use, and what we do with the waste products of the materials. It is also understood very clearly as a managerial tool for influencing compliance. What is culture? And this is something that's often missing from the conversation. Culture is a term that is used. It's often meant to describe a residual, whatever we cannot explain with bureaucratic procedures, rules, regulations, practices. What's missing or what can account for the gap is a lax culture, a poor safety culture, and that if we fix the culture, we can actually deal with the problems. Culture is a system. It's a system of norms and values that directs, delineates, guides people in a culture about the appropriate way to think, talk, act, and feel. So culture is made up of norms. Norms are expectations about behavior, what defines successful role performance in a given setting, and they have a very specific ought or must quality. Values provide rationales for these normative requirements. Okay? Culture is not an individual level characteristic. It is something that we can observe in a setting. We can observe it both by what people state formally, so what are the stated values, priorities, expected behaviors in an organization, in a profession, in a laboratory. We can also observe it when we enter those spaces. We can see how are people dressed, what are the symbols, what are the rituals, the routines, the language used, and the stories that people tell. So just to make this a little more concrete, when I walk into a lab or when I study laboratories, I look for indications of the safety culture. All labs, all universities already have a safety culture. Trying to audit or understand what that culture is important, as well as trying to change it. And so when I go into labs, I can observe very quickly, are researchers wearing coats? Are they wearing glasses? When you talk to graduate students and understand why they don't, what are their rationales for not wearing laboratory coats? Do PIs actually participate in inspections? What does it mean to graduate students, to administrators, to undergraduate students when they see PIs doing this work? And what does it mean when they are absent from these kinds of processes? What does it signify about the role, the place, the value of safety in science? Or, for example, does the PI start lab meetings by talking about safety? Do they talk about recent breaches, potential accidents, near misses, or is safety the butt of the joke? Is it a priority in the organization? So one of the recommendations that the National Research Council and the Safe Science report had is that safety performance should be part of the promotion decisions in universities. It should inform tenure decisions. It should inform pay increases. Do organizations actually do this? And when they do this, if they were to do this, it would signal very strongly what role, what place safety has in science, in the organization, and, for example, in the tenure process. So those are aspects that you can observe about a culture of a lab or a culture of an organization. You're going to get the idea today that that cultures are always heterogeneous. They're multiple. There is not one culture in an organization. There are multiple. Culture is transmitted through socialization processes. So beginning through graduate training or even earlier, researchers are observing and learning how successful members of their field think, act, and talk. So how does a competent member of the community I belong to behave? Is there attention to safety, security, and risk? Is that part of being a respected researcher? These are signals that we send to our students as we train them and as they go out into the world. So the culture is taught. Now, how do we change cultures? So if you think about how do cultures evolve and how do we change them, this is one of an issue when you think about recommendation 4, how do we create or promote a culture of responsibility, a culture of safety. There are really two ideas about this, and I'm going to tell you about the two ideal types that are kind of at the ends of the spectrum. The first is that culture can be self-consciously engineered, that it can be designed. And that organizations have been able to do this. So if you look at British Petroleum, if you look at Dow Chemical, both of these companies have very strong safety cultures. These have been top-down, centralized endeavors. They are slow. They are incredibly expensive. They require ongoing maintenance. There are entire departments of people who are responsible for safety culture. So safety cultures can be changed and re-engineered, redesigned when we are operating in a very bureaucratic environment. Okay? The other way to think about how cultures develop, but also how they change, is the emergent model. And this model is more suited to scientific endeavor because it acknowledges that each discipline or subdiscipline already has a culture. There is already a culture of safety. It's old, it's established in most scientific disciplines, and that these disciplines are not closely or centrally managed or top-down managed. They emerge. And they grow and they change over time. And so there really, in scientific cultures and laboratory cultures, there really are, many people would argue, and I do argue, really limited means of top-down, centralized culture change. And that culture is going to have to emerge from within scientific disciplines and subdisciplines. And we know from studying culture over long periods of time that this often happens because of a shock or a change in the environment, which requires that the culture adjust itself and change. It's slow, but it's very effective because it's self-reproducing. Right? If you think about how culture is transmitted, once it begins to change, it's a process of socializing each generation differently. I want to overlay culture on the other important factor that influences and shapes decision-making and behavior related to safety and security, and that is the social organization or the organizational structure of most research institutions. So what research institutions, universities, hospitals are professional bureaucracies. What this means is that you have an organization that has two very different sides. On one side, you have the administration. This is often where EH&S is located, the people who are responsible for ensuring safety in laboratories. That side of the organization has a very strong bureaucratic logic. There tends to be unity of command, which means each person reports up to another person. That person has formal authority over their direct reports. They have the ability to hire, fire. There tends to be centralized decision-making, and there are very stable and defined roles, relationships, and rules. So this is a very stable part of the organization, and one that we see more broadly out there in the economy. And this side of the organization keeps the place running. This is where you find finance, this is where you find accounting, you find HR, you find EH&S. On the other side of the organization, we have the academic side, and it operates according to a completely different logic. It operates according to the professional logics of each discipline. At least in theory, we operate according to collegial governance. We have a more democratic way of organizing. PIs have an enormous amount of autonomy in how they organize and run their laboratories. Decision-making is highly decentralized, often operates according to verbal agreements. Trust is a very important component in how things get done in these laboratories. And these laboratories are often in flux. They work on soft money. They are waiting for research grants. So the resources, the membership, the activities are changing continuously. Okay, so one thing to realize, if we think about changing culture, is it's quite easy to change, it's possible, and there are means centrally to change culture on the administrative side, in part because administration actually knows who works for them. It becomes a little more difficult when we go to the academic side of the organization, where we don't have even a central registry of who's working in every laboratory, because we have visitors, we have postdocs, we have graduate students, we have undergraduate students, we have lab managers who come and go as money arrives and leaves. In addition to this, these laboratories function according to relations of dependency. We have graduate students in these laboratories who are often, as I'll tell you in a minute, given responsibility for safety and security. However, while they have this responsibility, they are still highly dependent on their PI for the start of their career. They require the approval of their PI to graduate, for example. They require letters of recommendation from these people, and they require, frankly, ongoing support from these people, advocation from these people throughout their career. So a really interesting dynamic when you look at these two sides of the organization running very differently. It's also important to note that in most organizations, the administrative side has less say, that the academics tend to run the organization, and in interactions between academics and administration, you can frequently see these power imbalances. So this has implications for how we think about safety and security, responsibility, who is responsible and how do we ensure responsibility for these requirements, who has authority in these organizational structures to enforce, and who is actually doing the facilitating of compliance. It also has implications when we talk about recommendations for culture change. Which culture are we talking about, and what are going to be the sources of change for those cultures? I want to tell you a little bit about the findings we have about compliance in laboratories and how compliance is achieved in laboratories. And I want to make it very clear that our research has not been in BL3 or BL4 laboratories. This is a large gap in the research. It is related to the difficulty of obtaining access. For people like me, we need agreements from several levels, and so this is something I'm pursuing, but this kind of access is difficult to get and takes time. So let me tell you what we found across laboratories that are not BL3 or BL4 laboratories. And here are some of the highlights of the findings. First is that researchers experience compliance requests as intrusions and impediments to their work. This should not be surprising when I show you how these two sides of the organization work. So bureaucratic ideas about filling out paperwork, about completing forms, about doing things according to a schedule, don't fit with the same logic that happens on the other side of the organization. PIs tend to communicate safety as peripheral to research work, and it is often delegated to graduate students in the laboratories. We see that, and there's some really nice studies that show how researchers are very willing to incorporate safety features into their practices when they align with efforts, the scientific efforts, to control physical matter. We also know from some very great work that Susan Silby is doing that when we look across one institution for 10 years and we analyze the inspection results, we analyze the incident results, we know that most violations are, first of all, very minor. So these are safety violations related to biosafety materials, radioisotopes, chemicals, every sort of hazard you can imagine in laboratories. Most of the violations are minor. They are housekeeping. So this means that things are mislabeled. This means that caps are not on bottles. This means that the lab needs to be tidied. This means that signs have not been updated. We also know that a small number of laboratories account for the majority of the violations. Okay, and so I see people smiling. We know who those people are in each one of our institutions. It's not a surprise to learn that violations go up when professors get tenure. It's also not a surprise to know that when you have a full-time lab manager, you have fewer violations. Okay, so this is about resources. That last point is about resources. Here's what else we know. We know from our research about the incredible importance of the techno-legal experts in each one of these organizations. So these are the people who often work on the administrative side of the organization, NEH&S, and these are the people who pick up the slack to make sure that compliance happens. So we know that biosafety officers, health physicists, industrial hygienists are the people who often buffer researchers from things that are important for compliance, but PIs either don't have resources to do them, don't have time to do them, don't see them as part of their job, such as record keeping, inspection reports, looking at correction and maintenance and maintaining compliance. So these people are incredibly important in managing the gap between current practices and the requirements of regulations or other requirements. We know that people who are very good at these jobs are able to negotiate increased compliance by working in the laboratories. When biosafety officers adopt the logics of PIs, that means that they work on principles of trust, familiarity, they develop relations, they demonstrate to scientists that they understand what it means to work in a laboratory, and they do this by actually being in laboratories frequently, getting to know the labs, doing work in the laboratories for scientists. Often it's not glamorous work, but scientists appreciate it. So they are able to do a few things. One, they're able to anticipate problems. These people are able to, for example, understand when PIs are running low on money. When they know PIs are running low on money, they know they have to check more often. They know that they may have to offer funds to help them get rid of waste or to help them organize some compliance issues. When PIs are in the tenure process and they don't make it, they know these are the labs, so they know this information. They know these are the labs they have to attend to. When they know a lab is close to a discovery, is wrapping up, getting to the end of a research project, they know they have to go more frequently. They know people are tired, they know people are excited, and these are the people that are able to identify emerging dangers. They also know when laboratories are changing their research focus, so they're using new materials or new protocols that they may need different containment levels for or different practices for. So these people are extremely important to maintaining compliance in laboratories. They often draw, and this I'm learning from our research in Canada, they draw on requirements and regulations to increase their authority in laboratories. So giving BSOs regulations and requirements allows them to exercise more authority in relation to PIs. We also know that these people are chronically underfunded. We usually don't have enough of them in our research institutions. So there are two implications from these findings. The first is that if we're going to think about culture change in relation to the kinds of projects that we're talking about in this panel, but also more broadly in science, the research suggests that the change has to come from within the scientific discipline or subdiscipline. And that in order to create safer, more secure laboratories, both within institutional boundaries, but also outside of institutional boundaries, we need to create, and this needs to come from within the disciplines, fundamental changes to what it means to be a competent researcher. That to be a competent researcher, it means also having a sense of responsibility for safety and security, and that this is part of being a competent member of the community, paying attention to these issues. What is great about this kind of approach to culture change, it's a slow process. It's very effective because it's self-reproducing. It is also global. So the profession is global. What it means to be an immunologist is a rather global definition. If what it means to be a good immunologist means that you pay attention to issues of safety, health, and security, that can spread globally beyond both institutional boundaries and national boundaries. Secondly, the research shows that we need increased support, or we need to support at least the BSO by creating a community of practice or by enhancing the existing communities of practice and the existing profession. So we need to understand what they know and build on what they know about practically how is safety and security produced on an ongoing basis. So in collaboration with BSOs and PIs, we need to develop studies that address the compliance gaps that they observe in laboratories, and we need to find ways to share these findings among the practitioners and to develop and share tools and models that can help these professionals continuously produce compliance in laboratories. I wanted to tell you very quickly about the responsibility movement, which is happening in some areas of science. The extent and the effect of these efforts are unclear. These are researchers within different areas who are acknowledging their obligation to society, and they're diverting resources from focal science to studying the safety of processes, materials, and products. And we see this in green chemistry, we see it in nanotechnology, in synthetic biology, we see an increasing focus on this. And also, surprisingly, maybe for some people, is the way in which the do-it-yourself community is actively thinking about safety and security through codes of conduct, but also we've started to study some of these communities in their daily meetings, in their regular meetings, on their websites, in their interactions. Safety and security are actually front of mind. And then lastly, this is an innovative program that it's related to chemical safety, but it's a collaboration between a university and Dow Chemicals, in which they're taking graduate students over to Dow and teaching them how safety cultures work there, and giving them funds and resources to try to bring those safety cultures to the university. So there are efforts to think about cultural change, both through the responsibility movement and through interesting programs like this. Here's the code of conduct from the DIY biology group in Europe. So I guess in conclusion, a few things that we know from the research and that I would recommend that the members of the board consider or think about how this could work is that culture change will be most successful if it comes from within the scientific professions. It's likely to create long-term changes and global changes, and that we need to focus on the role of BSOs in producing the safety and security in the laboratories. And as other people have said already yesterday, we require more research on the daily decisions and practices in laboratories. In particular, we are missing research on the level 3 and the level 4 laboratories. Thank you.
Thank you.
So good morning. While we're setting up the slides, I'll just introduce myself. I'm Gavin Huntley-Fenner. I'm going to talk today a little bit about human factors, and I'm going to focus on the problem of attaining the risk reduction objectives outlined in the NSABB draft. And I think that by incorporating human factors, we need to incorporate human factors in order to attain these objectives. I'm going to move fairly quickly through some of my slides, and I'm hopeful that we'll have a discussion that will illuminate some of those earlier points. So just to outline, I'm going to talk about human factors, the role of human factors data in biosafety and biosecurity. I'll talk about the opportunity, think of this as the size of the prize, if you will. And then I'll try to point to the future, because I do think that there's some exciting options for us once we start to collect the right kind of data. So what is human factors? Simply put, it's a study of human reliability, and we draw on human capabilities and limitations in order to understand how to design environments, to do forensic analysis once adverse events happen. When we do those types of analyses, forensic analyses, for example, we find that human factors are, human error, if you will, are a contributing cause in the vast majority of incidents. And clearly, this is a priority, I think, from, as indicated in the NSAVB report, that in the recommendation number 4, which Ruthanne pointed to, this idea of a culture of safety, I think, rests on the ability to control, on the idea that we're going to be able to control error. However, we are challenged by a lack of good data on human reliability and human error, and Rocco Casagrande talked about that yesterday. Over time, and across industries, and in terms of lab safety, the picture is similar. We're seeing that human error is an increasing proportion of the injuries or the causes that lead to adverse events. Some of the contributing factors, when you look at the individual person level, include things like increased fatigue due to hours work. We just heard about long hours and the impact that might have on the safety behavior and safety culture. But there are lots of other things that can contribute to the emergence of error. And all of these things combine to reduce the application of skill. That is something you've learned how to do, and you have to do it over and over again, that you may make more errors when you're tired, for example, and also reducing cognitive functioning, that is, making decisions about risk and analyzing a situation for safety or the proper approach to dealing with a problem. WHO calls out human error as a primary lab biosecurity concern, and I'll just mention briefly that if you can control human reliability or reduce error, you accrue benefits in both biosecurity and biosafety. And as I mentioned, we know from the Griffin report that there's a dearth of data here. So one of the points I'd like to make is that I'd like us to think about the opportunity to collect data. What does that look like? Well, right now, if we look at the data we have and we see few adverse events, we may be tempted to think that means that we're doing a good job. But in fact, most of the important markers for safety are latent. And this is an image you've seen before, that this idea of latency, of unexpressed potential, is something that will cut across, I think, a lot of our talks today. So, for example, in this particular metaphor, you've got the idea of, you've got accidents, which are the things we observe, and incidents, which are things we may, accidents, things that we observe that result in a specific injury, let's say. Incidents, which are maybe things that we record. And then there are a lot of other things that we don't record, we may or may not record, that accrue to potential safe risk. And we know for sure that the bottom of that iceberg exists. The General Accounting Office did a study in 2009 looking at latent errors that haven't been reported and substantiated that story. Early last year, I wrote an op-ed on this in which I argued that human error is inevitable. But what does that mean? The inevitability of human error does not mean that gain-of-function studies of concern should not be done. In fact, it means the opposite. It suggests that if we understand the contributing causes to error, that we must understand the contributing causes to error and assume that there is some error if we're going to effectively continue the research. And I think human factors will provide tools for designing and implementing systems in which there are fewer errors or the impact of errors are mitigated if and when they do occur. Now let's talk about the size of the prize. We saw in the Griffin Scientific Report that there's potentially a significant upside from a risk reduction perspective to reducing human error, whether we're talking about workers who are working with seasonal influenza or coronavirus, or whether we're looking at hand contamination issues or just worker errors in general. There's a significant risk reduction benefit potential. Some simple approaches. So let's talk about some quick wins. What are the things we can do now with the information that we have or the tools that we have right now in order to reduce errors? A simple checklist has been shown to be an effective tool at reducing errors. That is, forcing people to stop, take stock of what they're doing in the moment, and just make sure that they're following standard operating procedures is in and of itself an important tool. But there are also other things that we can do to really understand errors and that fall into the category of quick wins. NASA in 2010 faced the same problem that our biosafety and biosecurity labs face today. That is, there was a dearth of data on human error that was specific to NASA operations. They found themselves pulling data from lots of different sources in order to understand reliability in a NASA context. And they essentially put a huge effort behind doing a deep dive on the data that they did have and came up with some reliability data that now help guide some of their decision making around risk and training to reduce risk. In Europe, this is an example from Belgium, looking at laboratory-acquired infections. Very, very easy thing, well, easy. A quick, what I would call in the category, put in the category quick wins, a survey mailed or delivered by internet to labs across Belgium, designed to get an understanding, a snapshot understanding of the status of quality and human reliability in labs. So here you're looking at these green, blue, and red bars. It may be hard to read from your position, but the green says there's strict compliance with these measures or practices. In blue, in general, this measure is respected well. In red, this measure is often not respected or put into practice. And we're looking at wearing a lab coat in the first column, wearing gloves in the second, changing protective clothing, carrying a mouth mask, a respiratory mask, carrying safety goggles or a face protector. Clearly, you get a snapshot view of the variability in quality or reliability across different labs. But understanding the status quo is one thing. Measuring existing error rates or reliability is one thing. Controlling it is another. And I do think that we need to put some effort into thinking about what it is we do with the data once we've got it in. How do we actually measure the variables that will allow us to control and reduce the likelihood of error. So this is a paper that falls into that category, published just this year, 2016, looking at factors associated with BL2 research workers' hand-washing behavior, and looking specifically at how it is you actually increase hand-washing behavior. And in this particular paper, they recommend multifaceted interventions in order to control the reliability of hand washing. Apart from looking at specific behavior of individual workers, we also need to consider the context. And we've heard from Ruthanne about the broader context of culture, safety culture within the lab, the culture of the administration of an institution that might accrue to safety. It turns out that you also need to measure culture in order to understand safety. For example, cutting corners were mainly due to organizational factors in this report from the UK. This is looking at focus groups. They gathered focus groups from CL3 labs in the UK, and they found that time pressure, workload, staffing levels, training, supervision were things that contributed to the detriment of reliability. Another aspect of culture, which was again touched on by Ruthanne, this is a chart showing the growth in environmental health and safety regulations on university campuses between in the 20th century, heading into the early 21st century. So this gives you a sense of what your environmental health and safety personnel are responsible for. And this is why they're quote-unquote overworked and why additional resources might be needed in order to effectively control reliability. So I'm going to head into now sort of conclusions and kind of looking forward where I think we ought to where I think we ought to focus. From the perspective of data, if you've got an apples to apples, you are really going to be in a much stronger position to look at safety quite broadly and in fact share information across institutions. So for example, if there were rigorous national reporting standards that go beyond the most significant adverse events, that would allow us to sort of measure the factors that may contribute, latent factors, for example, that may contribute to significant adverse events or perhaps to the safety culture at various institutions. Collecting near misses, of course, is quite important. Think of the bulk of the iceberg, which is constituted by things like near misses. Some types of events, of course, these adverse events that we're thinking about today are quite rare, so being able to compare across institutions and gather data across institutions I think would be helpful and allow generalization. Also, looking forward, I think it's important to sort of think about the general context beyond the safety questions that we're dealing with today. We live in an environment in which sophisticated analytics and algorithms are used to understand not just technology, but how human beings interact with technology, or organizations, or human behavior in the context of complex organizations. I think a really good example is that of geographic policing, where we collect data on, depending on the size of the police department, hundreds of thousands or millions of interactions between citizens and the police. We may also collect information on neighborhood histories. We look at the weather. We look at prison release statistics. And the police department is able to look across a city and say, okay, you know what, I think we're going to have hot spots in neighborhoods X, Y, and Z today. So I think we're going to deploy resources there. This is a well-established approach that's been effective in reducing crime. We're also looking at the emergence of using these sorts of data to predict when individual police officers might find themselves in an adverse event with extreme outcomes, and deploying training or intervention resources appropriately. I can imagine a time where if we have good data across a large number of institutions, we might be able to for example, considering of course, standardized data across institutions, we might be able to start to identify hotspots. What are the kinds of work where training would be most effective right now, given the limited resources we have available? And I think we ought to be thinking in terms of what the study of error might allow us to do 10 to 20 years from now. I think this is a distinct possibility. Now, being able to identify the potential adverse events before they occur would not only help to reduce risk, but also potentially help to increase productivity. I want to put forward the example of the Google car as a sort of a model, a conceptual model to think about. At the very beginning of the talk, I had a slide that sort of pointed to human factors, where it looked at the fact that human errors are contributing causes to about 95% of motor vehicle accidents. And Google was faced with that problem when they set out to design a car. So how do you design a car to operate safely and effectively in an environment where human error is an important and increasing proportion of contributing causes? Well, one of the things they did is not just sort of automate the vehicle, but they collected lots of data on human behavior, decision-making, millions and millions and millions of data points. And obviously this is an ongoing process. And they are able to use those data in real time, combined with informatics about the vehicle in real time, in order to reduce the risk of an accident. 6 years, 2 million miles, 17 minor collisions so far, and these data are as of I think December of 2015. So clearly, I want to give you a sense of the opportunity. I can imagine a future where labs are increasingly automated, where human error is a significant contributing factor, where we need to think about how to collect data so that we minimize the impact of human error. And I think that we ought to be thinking about the future as we go about studying human factors, studying human reliability, but B, designing a system to collect data that will allow us to reduce the potential for human error. Thank you. Oh, thanks. It was so funny. I saw the same thing.
Good morning. I was asked to share evidence with you regarding design and implementation of effective public deliberation. So to that end, I want to outline some very fundamental design questions with regard to public deliberation. Talk about how one operationalizes standard elements of public deliberation, including inclusivity, information, and value-based reasoning, and then come back to the issue of potential recommendations, very concrete ones, on how one could continue to apply public deliberation within the specific context. Where I can, I'm going to tie it back to the specifics of the current discussion. So let's talk about very fundamental design questions with regard to public deliberation. There's been a number of calls for public involvement. And usually when people think of the public, what comes to mind is the ordinary person. Oftentimes this is conflated with the non-expert lay public. It's actually more useful from a design perspective to think in terms of three fuzzy overlapping categories. One, which is I think what most of us have in mind when we think of the pure public, is that ordinary person who's disinterested and representative of the larger polity. The effective public, which would be persons or groups whose lives are potentially altered or influenced by the policy decision, and then partisan publics, which would be representatives of groups that have vested interests in the issue or a level of technical expertise in the policy matter. So how does that play out? If you look at some of the way in which the discourse has been constructed in the current conversation. If we look at the risk-benefit assessment, where there's the probabilities of an accident turning into an infection of a laboratory worker, which could turn into the local outbreak, which could turn into the global pandemic, you have sort of a string of potential affected publics in that conceptualization. Really rich analyses of an ethical nature coming out of a variety of writers, including Dr. Selgalid, who was commissioned by NSAB to provide a detailed ethical analysis. We have sort of that pure public, the people being presented, that if these hard ethical questions are to be best managed, that they have to be reflective of the risk-taking strategies and the values of the people. And then Nick Evans's underscore of an affected public being humanity. Partisan publics that have emerged in conversation with regard to gain-of-function research of concern. You know, the initial conversation involving microbiologists and flu researchers in particular, the desire for sort of broadening the tent and bringing in a variety of professions, science writ large, and then different disciplines such as medicine and public health. Another big design issue. All right, once you decide who this public is or set of publics are, what is it that you want them to do, right? There are a lot of legitimate, though very distinct aims. I'm just going to focus on two. One's innovation, the other's democratic accountability. You can bring people together in the sense that what you want are those rich, unpredictable insights that come from crowdsourcing a problem, right? Or you might be interested in democratic accountability, where you want to back up a policy decision with the argument that there has been broad representation demonstrated in coming to that conclusion. What are the desires that I've at least picked up from the discourse in gain-of-function research of concern? Is that there's an interest in diversity, balance, civility, accountability, and also coming back to this issue of people's consent. Another big design issue is, once you've picked your public or publics, you have a purpose in mind. What process what process enables them to fulfill that goal or that purpose? I think at this point it's helpful to sort of lay out, it's a very simplistic but very helpful continuum of public participation in the policymaking process. At one end you have communication, which is basically for basic matters of transparency. This is the issues we're addressing. Here's some background on the issues. This is what we're doing about it. Those are pushing out one-way information. The consultation of the public, which is to bring in, elicit opinions, views, perspectives, and have that as an input into the larger policymaking process. And then a third option is this more intense collaborative, i.e. deliberative approach, where there's an exchange of ideas and a shared responsibility for making and executing policy decisions. So just concretely, how have these different points on the continuum played out in the GOFROC discussion? Well, in terms of communication, we've got the press releases, such as the NIH funding statement, moratorium statement. We've got the websites put out by NSAB and NAS, and so on and so on. We have consultation, that elicitation of input, vis-a-vis formal mechanisms for public comments on draft NSAB recommendations. And then in terms of collaboration, the deliberative option has been fairly minimal with regard to affected and pure public, so to speak. And actually the collaborative, deliberative approach has been more in the realm of partisan publics. So the last design question is, well, okay, you got your public, your purpose, the problem and process you'd like to use. What is the issue, right? There's been proposals that there are very particular kinds of questions that are well suited to a public deliberative process. There's this conflicting values about the public good, the Apple FBI standoff about security versus privacy in the phone issue. Controversial and divisive topics where outcomes are perceived to produce winners and losers. This is oftentimes resource allocation, right? Whose research gets funded and whose does not. Hybrid topics where technical and normative aspects are interwoven. And then low trust issues in which the government and/or scientific community can earn, retain, or lose the public's trust. So, from what I've discerned, there are a few questions that actually fit those kinds of profiles. Under conflicting values, I've seen it phrased as, in terms of, despite potential contributions to public health, should studies that produce a pathogen of pandemic potential be performed at all, right? An example of a hybrid topic or a low trust issue is, if any, what added steps should trustee institutions, such as U.S. government and research entities, take to strengthen biosafety and biosecurity regimes and also strengthen public confidence in them? Two very different questions, so the question you pick really matters. So let's move away from the big design questions to more sort of practical operational issues. There is no single methodology for public deliberation. Just very, very concretely, a review of about 20 years worth of public deliberation in the realm of public health and health policy, and about 62 events in this review of what's going on out in the field. There was 10 distinct methods being used, right, including citizen juries. Well, why is there such diversity? Well, there's to be honest, no settled account of what constitutes public deliberation in theory or practice. I mean, every issue has its nuances, its particular partisan publics, and so on. And then, of course, there's real-world limits of money, logistics, politics. There is, however, consensus around what are the minimum standards for public deliberation, and they focus on inclusivity and diversity. Right, you want to compensate for the disproportionate participation by privileged classes of people, and you're trying to uncover that broad range of views and perspectives and conflicting interests. You want to make sure that there is factual, balanced information given to participants so that they can really grapple with the issue at hand. And you want to provide that opportunity for reflection and discussion of a free discussion of a wide spectrum of viewpoints, testing moral claims, and the potential for people to change their minds based on the arguments presented in rationale. In the interest of time, I don't want to go into the nitty-gritty in which these standards are applied, but just to pull out a few questions. Under the inclusivity and diversity standard in action, you have to ask yourself, whose interests are represented in the deliberative exercise that you have constructed? Who gets to represent those interests? How are those people chosen? Randomly, purposively? Is it a first come, first serve? Is it open to all? Each of those has very concrete implications as well as philosophical ones. And also, what concrete evidence can the organizers demonstrate to make claims to inclusivity and diversity? There's the information provision. We talked earlier about the selection of an issue, but how do you actually take a complex issue like gain-of-function research of concern and produce background information that speaks to the facts of the matter, so to speak, as well as the different positions that are in play? And are organizers going to lay out policy options, a finite set of policy options for people to consider, or are the deliberants going to be allowed to be flexible and free to develop their own set of policy options, so to speak? And then, of course, how does one manage the injection of the technical information? Value-based reasoning. How is it that you build build a process from a social dynamics point of view that's non-coerced, that allows respectful reflection on preferences, values, and concepts? Are you giving enough people time and space to learn the issue, acclimate to the process, and then to deliberate it, right? And then how is that input translated, interpreted, and packaged for use by the policymaker? These are all very concrete elements of public deliberation. It's important to also know that while there is no single methodology, there are markers of quality deliberations that are out there and being used in the field. From a procedural point of view, how good is your information? Is it comprehensive? Is it balanced? Is it accessible? How good are your deliberations from a social dynamics point of view? And you can measure that in post-deliberative surveys. Did you change your mind after what you heard? Did you feel like your voice was heard? Do you feel that all the voices that you needed to hear were at the table? You can survey that in terms of quality. And then, of course, there's issues of impact, right? Did it influence policy? Did it influence the level of confidence a policymaker has in his or her sense that he or she has made a more informed decision because they had the public deliberative input? And then from a participant point of view, what is their level of confidence in the legitimacy of the policy decision? So let's tie this back. I want to close down now with some very concrete, specific things that I think should be considered at this point that relates to public deliberation. This is my assessment of where we are in the process. We have the formal institutions of NSAB and NAS being the priority venues for public input. We've got meetings in which there's been a large representation of very necessary partisan publics due to the complexity of this issue. There is a strong desire to protect the public well-being, and that motivates all opinions in this conversation. But I would argue that the voices of a pure and/or affected publics have been largely absent. So the unresolved issue is, will there or should there be more sophisticated, resource-intensive deliberative sessions outside the present circle of vested parties? So, some three concrete suggestions to be considered is, should there be a formal evaluation of the current deliberative process that's been enabled by the formal structures of NAS and NSAB? How would the deliberants themselves, mostly of partisan publics, rate the process in terms of inclusivity, information provision, and support for value-based reasoning? I think the benefits of this formal evaluation include strengthening the evidence base with which people can judge the legitimacy of the policymaking process to date. And it certainly provides very useful data if there should be plans for any additional deliberative activity. Another concrete way to go, which considers more the issue of affected publics and deliberation that involves them, is potentially holding deliberative exercises in communities now hosting facilities that host high containment facilities. Yes, we're talking about a low probability, high consequence type of risk, but we're also talking about a very concrete place-based activity. Labs, institutions, there are host communities that, should there be an issue, either with an infected worker or a local outbreak, there are response institutions in place. So I think that one can bring in that type of conversation with a set of affected publics. You could ask them, how should we strengthen our protection regimes? How do we strengthen public confidence in them? Or you can ask should these types of experiments be done in the first place? You got to make a choice, though, about what question you're asking. And to conclude with the pure affected publics issue, It is arguably beneficial to engage a cross-section of the American public in a deliberative exercise, say deliberative polling or a citizen jury, about specific questions. It could be of the resource allocation nature. Should our limited research dollars go here, or our limited flu preparedness dollars go here or there? Should these experiments of concern be done at all? I think that these three concrete suggestions, if there were activity in one or more of these, certainly here in the US, and I have not touched on the international domain at all, okay? It's a very complicated issue. Certainly if there were concrete processes that were engaged within the US setting, it would provide a point of comparison for other countries and could be part of a harmonization endeavor. So with that, I'll conclude, and thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. So so a couple of points that I encourage people to come to the mics. As Harvey has said, our committee, this is a workshop. We're not providing recommendations, but we encouraged but anybody can offer recommendations, and they will go into our report, and we encouraged our panelists to offer recommendations based on their own professional experience and research. I would say for those of you who are not familiar with the social behavioral and decision sciences, this will give you some idea of the breadth and depth of the research that's out there if one wanted to put the human aspect of this enterprise on a scientific foundation that shows you the mix of methods that we all use. There's theory, there's multiple methods of observation, direct observation, laboratory and field experiments, traditional statistical analysis and data mining. I was thinking that one of the things that's sort of somewhat atypical of the social behavior and decision sciences, and maybe one of the reasons why some people are reluctant to go there, is that the basic disciplines often tend to operate in stovepipes. You have sort of sole proprietorships if somebody's really tied into their story. What's different in the talks that you heard here, and the people who are, the people like ourselves who are drawn to these complex problems, is that the commitment to the problem enables us to talk to one another and use one another's methods. So if you've been discouraged in the past, you have people like this to help you in the future. So you've had communication, time for consultation, and maybe it will lead to collaboration, right? and let me particularly encourage, see if I got this right, let me encourage the diverse views. So if your voice hasn't been heard, only if it's said verbally, if it's said out loud, will it make its way into the report. So if you've just been exchanging things with your friends, please come to the mic. Please.
Hi, I'm Kavita Berger from Griffin Scientific. I have two questions for the speakers. So the first question is that several speakers and commentators have suggested a comprehensive reporting system for human errors, but this raises a lot of questions about how to ensure that institutions do not that this can be done in a non-punitive way. And so what are your suggestions to promoting non-punitive approaches by the political and regulatory system, as well as by the public, to encourage, this comprehensive reporting? And then the second question is a little bit different. I'm not sure if you have touched on it or whether it's even appropriate for this particular panel, but actually it's a question about human errors for security and not safety. So quite a bit of work has been done in behavioral threat assessments and threat assessments, but there's quite a bit that institutions can do very far upstream. And so what are your suggestions for addressing the potential underlying factors that might contribute to someone either stealing an agent or animals, or vandalism, violence, deliberate misuse, et cetera? Thank you.
Is that,
Maybe Gavin, yeah. I think.
Well, thank you, Baruch. Let's see. So one possibility, regarding the first question, I was having a conversation earlier today. I think one thing you might do is change the heading on the paperwork so that theft and loss aren't the sort of categories under which the reporting is made, right? So there's some very simple things you can do, but I also think that there has to be some kind of give and take, right? So if you're just sending data out there that gets recorded by some bureaucrat who will at some unknown time in the future come whack you over the head with it, that's a problem. But if you're helping to construct a model that you can use to better manage your safety, and you know that we're going to get some interesting analyses and analytics back that will help us, that may be another thing you can do as well. Regarding the second question, I'm not sure of the answer to that question. It's a great question. It's something that needs to be studied.
Want to add something on that?
Just quickly to add, the Canadian government has just implemented a system for reporting, a national reporting system, and it picks up exactly what you're saying. Oh, there were numerous issues around privacy, around being liable, and so all of that had to be sorted out so that people understood it was a non-punitive system that also interacted well with workplace safety systems, legal and so on. But certainly one of the promises is that the data, the findings would be fed back to improve safety programs.
That's great. Thank you. Please.
I'm Susan Wolf. I'm a member of NSAB, but of course speak only for myself right now. I have two specific questions where I am going to ask your advice directly for this report. The first question has to do with data collection, data standards, and the erection of data collection systems. And I'm inviting your advice on what we should say about that. It comes up not just in recommendation 4, as you saw, but throughout, including recommendation 2, where the current draft talks about the adequacy for some pathogens of current oversight systems if appropriately effectuated. I'm not quoting directly, but that's the gist of recommendation 2. That if suggests the necessity of an evaluative process. I'm also thinking about some analogies that already exist, rough analogies, like the RAC's creation of GEMCRIS for gene transfer research, the creation of data collection transparency systems. So this is, NSAB formulating recommendations to the federal government. Not speaking to academics, so of course there are multiple audiences for this. So your thoughts about what NSAB might recommend be created, that's question 1. Question 2, Monica, goes to what you said. So you were talking about public deliberation, but there's another face of that you didn't have an opportunity to touch on, and of course any of the other panelists as well, which is whether there's a need for a Federal Advisory Committee Act entity, a FACA committee, in the loop of federal consideration of GOFROC. So this is a question that Sam mentioned yesterday in setting up the 5 questions on which we particularly wanted advice. Ken echoed it in his remarks. So if you think about the flow chart, which perhaps you saw and recollect, which is a draft of how this process might work institutional and federal, there was a loop out to the right if potential GOFROC was identified. And the question is, who's doing that loop? Whether it's just internal to the federal government, which of course is an option, or whether in addition, and again, of course, you can hear the echo perhaps of gene transfer research and FDA plus RAC, or whether there's additionally a FACA committee. So if you might be able to reflect on both of those questions, I think it would be enormously helpful.
Thank you. Start with Monica.
Sure. Given the complexity of the issue, the number of institutions and individuals whose practice matters in biosafety and biosecurity, you have to have a multi-layered approach, I think, not just to safety and security from a technical perspective, but also from a transparency and public engagement perspective. With regard to a FACA-like entity, That would take care of one level, but I think there are parallel injects of a variety, diversity of perspectives and opinions on what constitutes a safe, secure, and credible system with the public, so that there, for instance, Dr. Frothingham's Duke's system, Duke has created a system, right, with its IBC and IRE, which involves a diversity of perspectives, including members of different publics, both partisan and affected ones. Same thing with St. Jude's. So I think what you have, as far as potential recommendations, is one has to assure that the system has engagements, public engagement and transparency at all levels. A FACA-like committee would be, I think, a beneficial thing. It's not the only thing. I think one has to think of shared governance across all levels.
And on data?
And data.
Yeah, okay, so, well, I'll give what I think maybe part of the answer to what to say about it. I think it's important to sort of frame what we know and what we don't know. So we've said that we may continue this work. Our expectation is that we're going to be able to do it to a high degree of reliability. But our ability to continue to assess and ensure reliability is limited by the lack of data on the primary contributing factor, which would be human error, human reliabilities. We just don't have enough of insight into that. Therefore, in order for us to really attain what we're promising, we have to simultaneously put in place a structure in order to collect data and processes by which we can actually control and potentially reduce errors when they occur.
Let me, under the time constraint, let me do the following. Let me ask each person to give your question, try to keep it to within a minute, and then we'll have about a minute for each of our panelists to respond. Given the standard that Harvey set, I will not try to synthesize your questions, so please.
Hello, I'm Maggie Kozel from Georgia Tech, faculty in the Sam Nunn School of International Affairs. And I'm going to ask a specific question, but it's specific because I'm responding to the request for specificity. At the same time, I'm concerned that it may come up as a little bit more pointed. So if it does, in wanting to fulfill our non-adversarial culture, blame the pointedness for specificity. So this observation that incidents go up with tenure, first of all, I'd love to see the data on that. And the causal mechanism, why does that happen? And does it happen because of additional administrative burden, which would be my first hypothesis? And then how does that intersect with the call for increased public involvement? Is one more administrative burden of faculty supposed to be educating an illiterate public? And again, I'm being pointed because we're asked to be specific. Is this another unfunded mandate being put on faculty? So I could go on, but I want to highlight a couple of key pieces there, that we're talking about a much broader public that sometimes is adversarial to science and technology for reasons that have nothing to do with the science and technology. And culture has a whole bunch of pieces that it might be economics, and I loved how you articulated the economics, institutional drivers. And we haven't even talked about sexism and racism that affects cultural behaviors. So, thank you.
We did see two icebergs, so recognition of
penguins are represented.
Recognition of the hidden problems. Thank you. I'd like to have each person speak, and then we'll give our panelists a chance to
Thank you very much, Silja Wönicki, German Ethics Council, University of Freiburg, and Harvard Law School Fellow at the moment. I have two short questions. I liked your proposal, Ruthanne, that the culture change has to come from within the scientific discipline, because it's a very soft and non-interference approach. On the other hand, I think the incentive for scientists is to produce results, is to do science, to write articles. And therefore, I think, how can the change come from within science if there are no outside incentives for safety and security? This would be my first question. The second question would be, here in the US, there's a lot of talk about nudging. Mm-hmm. And my question would be whether there can be some sort of nudging the scientists to do the science in a safe and secure way.
Okay, thank you. And over here?
I'm Andy Kiliansky. I'm an NRC fellow with the U.S. Army. And this is just maybe a suggestion. So, talking about the human factors research, and we don't have a lot of data about accidents and human errors within the laboratory setting. I think the non-fault self-reporting in high containment labs it's a problematic thing to sort of enforce and enact. And compliance with that, I think, would also be a challenge. And so I think this is an opportunity for NSAB with their recommendations to sort of touch the broader life science community and perhaps suggest that we need to fund some studies looking at cohorts of grad students in BL1 and 2 spaces and evaluate how their errors affect their work and integrate that with their performance on a daily basis.
That's great.
Okay, thank you. Adam?
Hi, Adam Finkel from University of Pennsylvania. You know, sometimes when things seem to be sort of glaringly missing, it's because they're too obvious, but I think in the human factors presentation, the first 2 presentations, there's some things missing that I think it's important telling that they're missing. So one of them I mentioned briefly yesterday is inherent safety, designing out the consequences of human error, and again, my vague sense is that that's not come to the laboratory setting the way it has come to the healthcare patient care setting. Second is, I didn't hear any mention of part of the culture being the availability of a confidential channel for reporting of incidents. The whistleblower situation in the country is bad and actually getting worse. The laws are getting slightly tighter, but the culture within companies and government is, I think, getting worse. And then the previous speaker mentioned this a little bit, enforcement. There was really no discussion of the external norms that might be enforced in order to grow the culture of safety. Cultures like that don't spring up by themselves. They need some kind of external validation. So, you know, there's a literature on governance. I would just really briefly suggest that traditional command and control regulation probably is not a good instrument for this, but there are a couple of models, one being third-party auditors. EPA and OSHA have talked about that in the chemical process world. Hasn't gotten very far because of skepticism about the independence of the third parties. And I encourage you to look up a term of art called enforceable partnerships, which would be some model of kind of like a consent decree without a precipitating event needing a consent decree, but an industry or a group comes to government and says, this is a code of practice that we think is reasonable, it's flexible, we will follow it, and we will sort of cede over to government the ability to periodically make sure that we're abiding by our own code of conduct. I think in this case, with OSHA being so overmatched, there'd need to be some kind of funding mechanism as well to provide some troops on the ground to enforce that.
Okay, thank you. So two more quick comments and then a quick follow-up here.
Good morning. My name is David Drew. I'm just a concerned citizen, really curious. My comments are specifically directed about public deliberation. Everything I've learned about GOF has been at this conference, the few hours of research I did before. So I feel perversely qualified to talk about public engagement in that regard. What it struck me that public engagement could be seen as similar to upstream engagement, in that it is an effort by scientists to persuade the public around to the opinion that is the consensus of the experts. So I just want to ask is upstream engagement and public deliberation similar or the same thing? And should scientists perhaps leave the the public engagement on science issues and developing public understanding of science issues to science journalism and science journalists.
Thank you very much. And our last comment or question.
Megan Palmer, again at the Stanford University at the Center for International Security and Cooperation. First, I just wanted to thank this panel. It's actually very refreshing and illuminating to see a specific focus on these topics at the start of the day. I wanted to ask, in light of the focus to have specific recommendations, to what extent can you recommend specific strategic interventions to allowing sustained scholarship on the social and behavioral dimensions of research, given that there has been long-standing tensions in integrating these types of observations, this type of work within scientific practice and within the life sciences in particular. What, in your experience, have been essential elements to kickstarting and sustaining that process, be it just the resources allocated, partnerships with key individuals in the field, designing the databases in the first place? Is there anything in particular? And is there anything unique, either for the benefit or the detriment of gain-of-function research and the way it's been framed as a way to have an example of how this type of research and partnership might be operationalized in the future?
Well, let me thank you all for these excellent questions. I wish we had a lot of time. So maybe just one final comment from each of you, starting with Ruthanne.
So the issue of culture change is a very sensitive one in this particular context because we are dealing with elites. We are dealing with highly educated elites who expect to have autonomy. They are not let me say, there is not a lot of openness to ideas that come from elsewhere. So I really do fundamentally believe that the ideas about the importance of safety and security in science are going to have to come from some of the best researchers in each discipline. We need the leaders in these disciplines to model, you used this word, to model the importance of these values and normative expectations in research. We need the journals to expect it. We need conferences to highlight it. It is going to have to be pushed from within. The idea of some sort of partnership with outsiders or something that looks like a consent decree, which is what we observed at a major research university, was not a convincing argument for elite scientists to change the way they behave. I do think the idea of nudge is incredibly interesting and important, and I think it identifies a way that we can collaborate. So, for example, I am currently designing nudge experiments that will be field experiments within research laboratories to understand what kind of nudges can actually change culture. But you can imagine a collaboration in which we modify the experiments to understand some of the human factors research. So this is a very fruitful discussion.
Gavin, a last comment.
Yeah, just wanted to say briefly, I mean, I think one of my main points is that the dearth of error doesn't mean that what we need to know is unknowable. And so I take that to heart. Someone asked a question about the safety hierarchy, and I wanted to sort of just briefly mention there's a kind of an interesting paradox that goes along with that. You design out human error, you get the Google car, and you reduce error rates and accidents to near zero, but all the error you have left is human error at that point. When you put a steering wheel in the Google car, things go wrong. So something to think about. You'll always need to focus on the human error piece, regardless of the design trajectory.
Yeah, and Monica.
I'm tying some of Ruthanne and Gavin's comments with yesterday, some of the things that were raised by Larry Kerr. I think the issue of best practices, particularly by those researchers and their host entities and their relationship with the larger community in which they're situated. But there are best practices that I think have yet to be captured, synthesized, and put forth as best practice guidance around biosecurity, biosafety, and biocredibility, if you want to call it. On the issue of is this just scientists bringing people over to their side of the argument? I think that was the bottom line of that first question. What's important about public deliberation is that In areas of ethical uncertainty, technical complexity, where there's this sort of a total interwovenness of the technical and the normative issues, that there has to be a shared dialogue. It isn't about bringing someone over to the scientist point of view, even if there was just one point of view. It really is that iterative exchange of information to come at, hopefully, some type of mutually agreeable common ground. And even if it's not your side of the argument, you can live with whatever the final decision is. And it's a little bit different than just pure persuasion.
But let me thank the panel and thank the audience. And we'll be back here at 11.